That's beautiful, Elena. Thank you so much. Wow, doesn't that sort of just ask the question? Doesn't that bring the whole thing to a point? And that first song by Don Henley, "The Heart of the Matter," Don Henley's probably singing in one sense about a relationship that he's had with somebody that's probably broken, and he's feeling that isolation and that pain. But as I think about our reality that we're in right now, I think we can all safely say we experience that relationship in just about everybody, at least every day. We see it online, or we see it at the store, or we see it in the parking lot, or we see it with our own family or friends. We see that sense of being broken and trying to get back to the heart of the matter, and we're just finding it really difficult. And as Susan Werner says in her song, well, how do we even begin to love those people? And of course, as you know, when I speak about those people, I'm speaking about how they love us too. I'm speaking about us as well as anyone else. The reality is, there is no those people. There's just us. Or, as I want to suggest today, in this idea of the courage to be, I'm having a little trouble with this staying put. There is no us, there's just me. That's what I want us to think about today. So I love this song. I love this story. I love this story because I used to hate it. I used to think this story was pedantic. I found this story shallow. Because when I was younger, when I was in the evangelical church, I thought this story was amazing. Are you confused now? I thought the story was amazing when I was in the evangelical church because I thought, I want to be like that. I want to be like Jesus. Number one, I want to be able to do these kind of miracles, release the demons from people, these crazy people that we knew, these crazy acting people that we would see. Some of our friends sometimes, we would have this idea that we could free them from their demon possession. And we love this idea of, even though we are scared by it, we love this idea of demons, So the popularity of shows like Supernatural or I can't even remember some of the other ones, my favorite vampire. I forget what they were all called. Buffy the Vampire Slayer. We love this idea of the supernatural. And yet, we only love it because we like toying with it a little bit. We like to kind of tease and play with it. But the idea of actual being overwhelmed by such evil scares us. And so I love this idea that we could be like Jesus. We could do these miracles. And then I also like the idea, well, if Jesus could do that, then Jesus is around today, and Jesus can still do those kinds of miracles, still do those kinds of freeing me from my bondage or freeing my friends from theirs. And so I thought it was a great story. And now, well, more recently, I won't say now, but more recently I came to see it as just pedantic, as just shallow and kind of controlling. And the people who wielded the story used it in an oppressive kind of way. The people who oriented themselves around that kind of orientation to these stories also kind of used it oppressively. And then the story became something else. I'd say for the past 7 years I've been on this journey with you all online as well. This idea of what 1111 is sort of about, this open-minded, open-ended journey of sort of seeking out deeper connections with what we used to understand or how we used to think about something. And rather than throwing out with the bathwater, maybe there's a new way of seeing all of this. And now I see this story in a very profound way. Because all you have to do is look around, you see demon-possessed people all the time, right? Who here hasn't felt a little demon-possessed themselves? Who can't remember a time when whoever you were with thought you were possessed? Right? And we just look at the media, we look at the kinds of conversations that happen, we look at the kinds of speeches that are happening and the vitriol that's happening, and it's pretty easy to look around and say, there's a lot of demon possession going on right now. Peter Mayer, that wonderful song, Holy Now, used to say, wine from water is not so small, but an even greater magic trick is that anything is here at all. That's kind of how I look at it now, right? That's how a lot of us look at it. The reality that these stories speak to something far more profound than a simple, shallow, or concrete idea. They speak to the reality we live in. They speak over time to the reality we live in. So now I think about this story and what are the demons and how do we face life? How do we show up in life with courage? That's what I think this radical friendship is really all about. I saw this picture the other day. I wanted to share it with you. called the Church of the Stunned Chicken. I don't know what I thought about that. I looked at that and I thought, yep, that's kind of reality. I'm sure that those folks didn't realize that their chicken was stunned like that their church is stunned, but there's people looking from the outside thinking, yeah, it's a little strange. The whole thing is a little strange. But here from the inside, I think we could say the same thing. We are in a very strange time. We've been here for a few decades. Some would say we've been here for several generations, and others would say we've been here for thousands of years. We've evolved. We still haven't reached that place of consciousness where we can really step out from who we are and see it from a much more interconnected, interdependent objectivity. It's so hard for us to do that. It's so hard for us to think non-dualistically because we just are conditioned to think in terms of me and you, us and them, right and wrong. It's hard to get past that kind of binary reality. And then this whole time that we've been in, have you been having this problem? You can't tell what time it is? Not like the time of the day, but like what year? What day of the year? My 65th birthday? What? What happened to my 63rd? I don't remember having a birthday. I barely remember Christmas 2 years ago. I remember Christmas this year, but I just remember thinking when it got here, I wasn't prepared. And if you talk to somebody and say, you remember that time that you did that? And you want to go like, well, was that in the 90s? Or was that the early 2000s? I mean, the fact that we've had these 2 years that have disoriented us has kind of created some chaos. So the other day, I was walking with this guy that I've met. I'll just call him John. But we walk on the trail out to Trinity Park. He sometimes shows up the same day, so we've been walking. And we'll walk about 2 miles. We do a loop through the woods. We've actually timed it out on our phone so that we know the distance. The other day, I'm walking with him half the way out. He stops. I look at John. I say, John, what are you doing? And he starts to turn around. He says, I'm getting tired now. I decided I can't go as far. So we got about halfway. He says, I'm just going to go back. You following what I'm saying? I said, okay. I walked my path. We got back at the same time. We just don't even know what we're talking about sometimes. We're just disoriented. Yeah, today I'm only going to walk half the distance. I'm just going to turn around right here and go back. Okay, I'll see you when I get back then. I mean, it's very disorienting this time that we're in. And I read this article in December that really, I think, captured it. Because I've been trying to think, are we depressed? Not really. Are we angry? Well, yeah, sort of. You have those days where you wake up or you think about things you were going to get done and you think, I didn't get anything done. And I realized the word was in this New York Times article that this author wrote, and he called it languishing. We're kind of in a time of languishing. I feel like that's kind of where we are here with 1111 in this room and in this space. We're not meeting in the round right now. I don't know if we should start meeting in the round because I don't know if that means we're going to suddenly start having more COVID and more restrictions. And so then if we meet in the round, it's going to be really a skimpy crowd sitting in the round in here. And then how we used to do things, like bringing the singing bowl out. When should I bring it back out? When should we bring out incense? We used to do incense. I met with the steering committee this last week, and there was all these things that came out of the study that said, when are we going to do that again? I'm in this time of sort of languishing. I don't know what should be done next. I don't know. It's kind of like we've been living in survival mode. The motivation is there, but not really. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you feel some of that yourself? I mean, some of you retired early because you thought, why even keep trying, So why, I'm just going to retire now. It's why keep going through with this? Some of you Sharm had to retire during the COVID. We had sort of a celebration online. Some of y'all might remember we did that back in the day. I think that was 8 years ago. Yeah. Yeah, you're looking good. You're looking good. I want what you're having. So it's kind of like this raccoon, this next one. I thought this was a fun picture. Why is being alive so expensive? I'm not even having a good time. Don't you just love that? That's how it feels like. I'm sort of out on the trail. There's stuff happening around me, but I feel like I'm just out here on the trail. Not real sure what's coming up next, but I'm going to keep going. And then we see the anger, and we see the vitriol, and we see the divisiveness, and we see that's been going on now for several years more intensely. And so I came up with this idea of radical friendship may be what we need, but it's hard to do that. I said radical friendship, we talked about giving what is hard to give, doing what is hard to do, enduring what is hard to endure. And then this last week, as I mentioned, as I was talking about white fragility, my own sense of white fragility. The book that DeMarco, I forgot her first name right now, but that she wrote, the book White Fragility, and what it speaks to for a lot of us, I think, in this time of reckoning and understanding our participation willingly, unwillingly in the systems of our culture, the oppressive systems of our culture. And here, as a white person feeling a bit fragile, I said that, and I actually had several responses on emails, and a person that I met with over coffee, and then someone else came up to me, and the response was, I don't agree with that at all. I'm not fragile at all. And what occurred to me was the problem we have sometimes with vulnerability, the challenge we have in showing up to these moments every day, the normal ones, the average ones, and the vitriolic ones. The moments that we show up, we have trouble being vulnerable. And so we immediately react. That's the whole cancel culture thing, right? It's the reaction back and forth. We react to what happens rather than showing up with vulnerability. So I thought maybe that the last thing that we should talk about was Paul Tillich, the theologian, had this great phrase that he called the courage to be. I'm not going to get into the theology of that because it's a really fun, complicated dive into academics and theology. But what I will use is the phrase, because essentially what he was saying was that living in relationship to life, to yourself, and to one another takes courage. The courage to be. So I want to talk with that. I think we pull the slide up here. I'm going to define it for you. This is kind of how I'm going to sum up all of this, what it means to be a radical friend. It means opening our hearts to the vulnerability of our moments toward the restoration of innocence. I like that idea. I made it up and I like it. I told Linda about this. She says, what do you mean the restoration of innocence? I said, have you ever looked up the word innocence and looked at the etymology of it? Because I love to do that. I love to go back and look at words, what they may have meant when they first came out. The etymology is basically in, which means not, and then necra, N-E-C-R, which is the Pi root word, the Proto-Indo-European root word, and it stands for death. Innocence, not death. That pretty much sums it up, doesn't it? The courage to be has to do with this willingness to show up, to live into life, to proclaim life in the moment, as opposed to fear, anger, greed, resistance, death. What does it mean to restore our innocence in the world? So, I'm going to have some fun and tell you this story that comes out of India. It's a Hindu story. Actually, it's a Buddhist Hindu story, but I believe it was a Buddhist monk by the name of Milepa. Milepa was a 13th century monk who had a terrible history of violence in his life. His family had been abused. Their kingdom, what they owned in the kingdom, had been taken from them by a previous ruler. His mother trained him and had him trained in sorcery. And then, according to the story, he was able to use that sorcery and wreaked revenge and havoc on all of those families. It was like a Hatfield and McCoy thing, and it just went on and on and on until after a generation or two, you could look back and you go, what is it we're fighting over? What is it we're killing each other for? And Milepa finally had this awakening that he had been doing this destructive thing and didn't know why. And so he went off into the caves and began studying under a teacher, under a master, who grilled him and grilled him and made him work hard to prove that he really wanted to go down this path of innocence. And so in time, he felt like he had. But he lived in the caves. He stayed in the caves for one reason, because he was afraid what would happen when he would go back. He didn't trust himself. So he stayed in the caves to continue to sort of explore and to try to disconnect himself from the illusion of his life, to try to see the illusion for what it is and then live into reality with more authenticity and, what would we say, more innocence, to show up vulnerably. So what would happen is, over time, his cave would get filled with these demons. And you know what demons I'm talking about. Shame, guilt, aggression, hate, anger. They would all show up in these different characters and qualities, and they would just sit around. And initially, he was terrified. Initially, he tried to drive them out. And the interesting thing would happen, the more he tried to drive these demons out of his cave, the more they seemed strengthened. You know what I'm talking about? Some of you are thinking about your demons right now. You know what I'm talking about? The more he tried to get rid of them, the more they were encouraged and stayed, until finally he did something. Finally he said, you know what? Come on in. He said, I'm going to go out and I'm going to get some food. He went out to his garden. He said, I hope you're here. Bring some friends. Let's sit around and have tea. And he wrote things that were later called the Psalms of Malepa. They were literally the songs he would sing to his demons to invite them to stay and to have tea with him and to have conversation. And guess what started happening? They started leaving. They started disappearing. Except for one, as the story went, there was one malicious, cruel, beastly, gnarly demon that would not leave and defied Malepa until finally Malepa did the one thing that no one would imagine, one thing that he did, the one thing that we can't imagine doing, I'm sure. I certainly can't do it myself. He stood up, walked to the demon, and then put his head in the demon's mouth. And the demon disappeared. All the demons vanished, and the cave was filled with light. And as Pema Chodron, the teacher, says, she says this, when the resistance is gone, the demons disappear. When the resistance is gone, the demons disappear. That's pretty much all I need to say, right? We can go home now. Where's the band? I mean, do you get what we're saying? The distance, when resistance is gone, the demons disappear. What we find every time we meet up with somebody, we come up against someone who is disagreeing with us, vitriolic, or who argues, or that we've had experiences like that with somebody, what happens? Resistance, 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 resistance. We do it in different ways. We might do distraction, and maybe the demons aren't the other person. Maybe they're our own stories inside, right? They're our own neighborhood that keeps going round and round and round in our head. And we resist, 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 and what happens? It just comes back stronger. There's this power in vulnerability that when we show up vulnerable, when we show up open to it, we begin to experience this fearlessness that simply has nothing to offer those demons. So there's this great story in the Men of Kelm. Speaking of how we deal with our demons, there's this great story from the Men of Kelm. Kelm was sort of like this fictitious Jewish community where all of the people in there, particularly the men, acted like idiots. But there was wisdom in their idiocy. You had to be willing to see it objectively, of course. So for one example, the town had been experiencing a lot of theft. And so the men got together and decided they were going to have to find out who the thief was, and so they caught the thief. It was the village blacksmith. They caught him stealing from somebody's house. They brought him out into the public. They were going to hang him. They were going to, execute him. And they brought him out there. They said, we have caught him red-handed. He deserves being punished. And as they were about to take him up there and, punish him, somebody said, wait a minute. He's our only blacksmith. What are we going to do if we kill the blacksmith? If we get rid of our blacksmith, we got no blacksmith. And just then a couple of men's faces lit up and said, we have 2 bakers. And so the village shouted, hang one of the bakers. A silly story, right? How often do we find ways of looking for scapegoats for our own anger, or our own vitriol, or our own fear, or our own self-doubt and anxiety? How long do we look or turn to something? How often do we do that? We look for something else rather than facing what it is right there in front of us. Because it's difficult. We're afraid of what's there. This idea of being vulnerable to what's there. We are so conditioned to be afraid, not to be afraid of shame, or to be afraid of doubt, or to be afraid of someone who disagrees with us. We are so conditioned not to do that, to distract ourselves, that it's hard to go forward with vulnerability. And yet, I think this vulnerability illustrates what is our biggest sin and our biggest problem, which is disconnection, right? That's the very thing, it's disconnection. Courage is that willingness to vulnerably show up in our moments with the understanding that when we do, with vulnerability, we begin to open a path towards the restoration of innocence. Because those with whom we might be disagreeing don't get it either, do they? They don't understand the interconnectedness that we find ourselves in. We show this next one. I showed this last week, but this is one of my favorite images. Guy says, you realize you could go out of there at any time. And then the guy inside the cage with the wide bars says, what makes you think I want to? We don't want to, right? When the demon in the story sees Jesus, what does he see? He doesn't see a powerful miracle worker. He sees his mirror. He sees the truth of himself. And that's really hard to face, isn't it? When we see the truth of our own anxiety, the truth of our own fear, you know where it often shows up? It'll show up in our dreams lots of times, right? We'll see them in our dreams, these things working themselves out in weird ways. I woke up with a dream the other day, and I looked at Linda, and I said, I don't know what was going on. I was at a train station. The guy said, you're the conductor. I said, I have no idea how to drive a train. They threw me in the engine, said good luck, and all the people on there going like, I hope you know what you're doing. I woke up, and she said, do you think you have a problem with leadership? I mean, our dreams tell us so much about us, right? Because they come out unconsciously. We don't have a chance. They surface, and then if we're conscious, we don't deal with them. We just move on. It's hard to show up. It's hard to show up in this place that we find ourselves. This next picture really spoke to me. I love this. Y'all know this one, right? This is the story of the Earthrise. Apollo 8, Alder, I believe his name was, the astronaut who was the one. The three astronauts were in the capsule. They were supposed to be taking pictures of the lunar landscape. They literally had a whole agenda lined up for them. You know this story? And Alder looked out the window and he says, oh my God. And they said, what? Get the picture, get the picture. He says, no, I need the color film. So that, I had to have different film back then, put it in the cameras. And they're looking like, no, get the picture. That's not on. He says, look at this, look at the Earth. Look at the Earth rising up over the moon. And they said, it's not on the schedule. But he's like, give me the color film, right? They're going to pass up what they were there for because they saw something for the first time. It is so hard for us to see things for the first time because we can't tell ourselves, we can't remind ourselves that we're not there for what we think we're there for, right? We bring our agenda, we bring our conditioning, we bring our presumptions, we bring our assumptions, we bring our knowledge to the moment, and we never see what's really there. Did you know, I was reading about William Blake, and the painting that he did of Moses and the burning bush. And it's kind of an unusual looking burning bush. You've seen this one? And it's interesting what he said about it. They said, you really captured the fire. He says, no. Here's the whole point. The bush wasn't burning. Moses saw the bush for the first time. You see that? There's a story of a man who was going to be visited by the king, and so the king wanted to see the man's rose garden. He'd heard all the reputation and rumors about this man's rose garden. The man went out before the king showed up, and he clipped every single rose except for one. One of the roses he left on the bush. The king came in and says, what had happened here? And the man said, I knew that if I had all the roses here, you would never see one of them. So I left you one rose to see. How often we don't see what's in front of us because we bring our perspective already. We bring our filters. We bring our lens. It's hard to show up with vulnerability. So I want you to see, this is the quote that Thich Nhat Hanh, I felt the need. We need to show a quote with Thich Nhat Hanh before I finish up with these last 3 points. Thich Nhat Hanh passed away this last week. Many of y'all heard that. 95 years old, the great Vietnamese Buddhist monk who was probably second only to the Dalai Lama in terms of Buddhism's influence in the West. He said, inner being is understanding that nothing exists separate from anything else. That idea of the inner being, the technology that I'm looking at involves thousands and thousands and millions of people, right, to get here. It also involves all sorts of concomitant problems because it's here in my hand. I don't think about all these things. I just enjoy my iPad. But there is interbeing in everything that we do and everyone. And so he says we are all interconnected. By taking care of another person, we are taking care of ourselves. By taking care of ourselves, you take care of that other person. And what I want you to understand is that this idea of practice, of spiritual practice that I keep sort of hinting that we try to do daily if we can, is because really restoring ourselves, loving ourselves deeply and vulnerably empowers us to be, in a way, it reflects our relationship with others. It reflects in our relationships with others. How we love ourselves, how we deal with our own vitriol, our own impatience, our own anger, our own resentment, our own hesitation, how we deal with that affects everyone else around us too. It all opens us up toward restoration, toward that path of regaining innocence. So here's what I think we can do. I'll give you the 3 steps very quickly here so we can wrap up. The band can come on up here in the back while I'm doing this. Step 1 in opening up to courage. How you show up in your moments. How do you show up in your moments with courage? How are you going to put your head in the mouth of the demon? How are you going to do that? Because that's what I'm asking you to do. In all these opportunities, all these moments, how do we put our head in the mouth of the demon? First one is notice and treat the experiences, the ideas that trigger us with equanimity. Do you know what I mean by that? Notice them. Stop and pause. DeAndrea said here in the Kairos moment, she said, returning to our breath. There's a reason why that's in a practice, in a lot of spiritual practices, because it reminds us we are all grounded in the same air. We share the same oxygen with one another. We share the oxygen that's been around for generations and generations. We are a part of all of that. Return to our breath rather than sitting with our hesitation, our resentment, our resistance. Just notice that's a trigger. That thing always triggers me every time I show up, and they show up with me. I don't want to listen to this. That's a trigger. The other day, the dog was barking next door. You got one of those? Anybody in here got a dog that barks next door? Anybody put up thousands of those high-frequency devices around your house to stop the dogs from barking? Yeah? Here's how I started dealing with it. Every time the dog barks, it's an invitation to center myself. You're going like, that'll never work with me. But that's what I'm suggesting. When you get the trigger, stop and breathe. When you get that trigger, stop and breathe and try to see something differently than what you've always seen. That's step 1. Step 2 is then to welcome the emotions without judgment, but with love. Now, love is an interesting word. I've told you this before, but I'll just remind you quickly. The root word of love actually means curiosity. It's not affection. It's not hugging. It's not, all those can be signs of love. It's curiosity. It's intentionally engaging with whatever's going on. That's curiosity. That's what love is. Think about your relationships with people. That's love, right? Curiously engaging with them. Not with your agenda, but you notice the triggers, you stop, you breathe, and then you welcome them. Like Malepa welcoming the demons. Come on in, let's talk about this, let's visit. What would happen if you actually sat down with people you were having an argument with, and instead of getting into that argument, you just continued to engage them with curiosity? Tell me a little bit more about that. You seem really passionate. How does that work for you? Where have you found that in your life? Tell me some stories about where that's happened for you. Engaging with curiosity. Then the third step is suspend judgment and cultivate that moment with connectivity. Sharing your own resonance with whatever story they share. Not your position, not your defense, but sharing with that moment. Now, maybe you're triggered by depression and your response is, I'm going to go eat. I'm going to go watch TV. I'm going to get on my phone and look at Facebook, or I'm going to get lost in the internet. There's all sorts of ways we deal with the triggers in our lives, right? Instead, what if we paused, we took a breath, we remembered to center ourselves with our breath, and then we invited that curiously. Let me think about this. I'm going to ask this demon who says, come eat something, I'm going to talk to it for a while. Ask some questions. Instead of getting on the TV, I think I'm going to ask some questions about what I'm doing. What else might I do? You just hesitate long enough not to let the trigger engage you into the old response. Carl Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. So I want to close with this quote from Henry David Thoreau, and then my last quote. You don't have this up here, but Henry David Thoreau said, through our recovered innocence, we discern the innocence of our neighbor. So as I invite you into this spiritual practice of being a radical friend, what I'm actually inviting you into is to literally relearn who you are in relationship to the world around us. And in doing so, we begin to invite a path of innocence with those that we encounter. The courage to be is opening our hearts to the vulnerability of the moment toward the restoration of this innocence, reminding us that indeed we are never alone, ever, because we are all one.